بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم وفقنا لما تحب وترضى ولا تكلنا إلى أنفسنا طرفة عين أبدا. Inshallah, we'll be going over our second session for the course on the human fitrah and the God-seeking nature within every human being. We will get started this week with a review of last week, and then inshallah we'll go on to some new material. We noted last week that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم. Soon we will show them our signs in the horizon, meaning beyond them, outside of them, وفي أنفسهم, and within themselves as well. And we explained that according to some scholars, the signs outside of them refer to the signs of Allah's creation, refer to the signs that point us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the world outside of us, and the signs within them refer to the human fitrah, our natural inclination to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق, until it becomes clear for them that it or he is the truth. Okay? And therefore, last week we started to think about the idea that every human being has a fitrah, and that fitrah can become a path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or the fitrah can possibly be a proof for the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Towards the end of today's class, we inshallah want to look at this question, that if the human being has a natural inclination towards God, does it then prove the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And I'll explain that question a little more when we get there, inshallah. Now, to review from last week, we started first to point out the difference between fitrah and tabi'ah, fitrah and gharida. This was an important distinction because normally we chalk up all of the natural inclinations that we have and we say that these are fitri, this is fitrah. Human being seeks a spouse, that is part of his fitrah, for example. Men have this personality, that's part of their fitrah. Women have such a personality, that's part of their fitrah. Human being seeks food, that's part of his fitrah. So last week we started to make a distinction. And we say that, look, there are levels of existence and there are inclinations at each level of existence. And there are names for these inclinations. So when we're talking about it at the level of inanimate matter or animate matter that does not have sensorial abilities like plants, we call it tabi'ah. The positive gets attracted to the negative. The plants get attracted towards sunlight. That is a part of their tabi'ah. And then we have animals like horses and lions and insects and birds and other living beings. They have what we call a gharida, an inclination. And we explained some of that last week as well. But then we say that when we come to a human being has an inclination not only that is a part of his tabi'ah, not only an inclination that is a part of his gharida, but an inclination towards a higher purpose, towards a higher meaning, towards a higher existence, towards more important questions, towards more meaningful questions. And that is what we call the fitrah. Okay, so it's important for us to understand that fitrah is different from those things which are part of human gharida, or those things which are part of our tabi'ah. And fitrah is a human being's inclination towards the higher truths. The second point that we made last week that's important for us to remember is that fitrah primarily is an inclination. So let's try to remember that word, inclination. Okay, it's a preference that a human being has. It's a direction that a human being has. It's a desire in some ways that a human being has. When the Quran talks about some type of fitrah, it doesn't mean that every human being is born with a particular type of knowledge. That, for example, human beings are born with the knowledge of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they need no further guidance to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and know the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We say that a human being, when he's born, Allah tells us in the Quran, He has brought you out from the wombs of your mother, لا تعلمون شيئا, whilst you do not know a thing. Fitrah is not knowledge of something in particular. Fitrah is this idea that our psyche, our mind, our soul, our being generally inclines towards certain ideas, is structured to go towards those ideas, thinks in a particular manner, finds it easier to think in a particular manner. There's a natural way for human beings to think, and there is an unnatural way for human beings to think. That natural way is fitrah. Okay? So let me give an example that Dr. Justin Barrett gives, and this might help to understand what we mean by an inclination. Dr. Justin Barrett is a researcher at Oxford Center for Anthropology and the Mind, and we'll look at some of his works today. But in one of the lectures that he was giving, he came into class and he brought a child's toy. I think most of you would have seen that toy because all children have played with it. You've got this toy that can be round in shape, or a box, for example. It has holes in it. It's one of those shaped toys, and then children have blocks. There's squares and triangles and circles and rectangles and stars, and they have to try and fit those shapes into that particular circle or toy. And if they put the right shape in the right socket, then the toy goes into that structure. So he says that, look, when we talk about certain things being innate to human beings, it doesn't mean that human beings are born with certain ideas. No, it means that human beings find certain ideas to be easier to accept. That when they come across those ideas, they naturally fit. Just the way the block naturally fits into that toy and it goes in with ease, right? If you chose any other shape, it wouldn't fit in. For example, if you took a square, you're trying to fit it into a rectangle shape, it just doesn't go in. The structure just doesn't accept it. He says, in the same way, there are certain ideas, when a human being comes across them, they naturally fit into his mind, into his psyche, into his being. And there are certain ideas that when a human being comes across those ideas, it does not naturally fit into him. It has to be forced into him. Okay? So the human mind isn't just indifferent. That's the most important point. It isn't indifferent to ideas, that any idea that comes to it, it has an equal inclination towards it, or that human beings have an equal inclination to truth and falsehood. That is not the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us. Allah has created the human mind and the heart to have a natural inclination towards the truth, so that whenever it sees the truth, it easily and naturally without any difficulty, without any internal struggle, it accepts those ideas. Okay? So fitrah is an inclination. Now, there are three standards for all things fitri, and we looked at some of these standards last week. The first one is that it does not have to be taught. These inclinations, human beings are born with them by birth. They cannot be taught, nor can they be removed entirely. Okay? So even parents who are both atheists, sometimes they find that their child, whom they have raised as an atheist, at a very young age, sometimes, Dr. Justin Barrett refers to an example that he knows where two parents were both strongly atheists living in an atheistic society, or what is considered, anyways, an atheistic society. When they're raising their child at a young age, almost 3 to 4 years of age, came home to them and one day and said, "I believe in God," and started to describe God. Okay, so these are things which are innate within every human being, and they have them from birth, and they do not need to be taught, nor can they be entirely removed. What can happen is that they can be strengthened or they can be weakened. The inclination can become more intense, or the inclination can become less intense. And the scholars of akhlaq mention what are those things that make our inclinations less intense. For example, sins make the fitrah less intense, or wrong doctrines, if they are continuously put into a person, they make our fitrah less intense, and therefore we have to be careful about what we hear, what we listen, and what we allow to come into our hearts. Secondly, we also mentioned that it is present in all human beings. No matter which society we go into, which culture we go into, the details of the inclination may vary. How we perceive life after death, is there reincarnation? Is there resurrection? Is there some type of, beyond? That may vary. But the idea that there is life after death is something you find across all cultures. And it is also present in all eras. So there's no period of human history that's going to be devoid of those types of inclinations. The last point, and I think there was some confusion last week about it, is that we need to make a distinction between what are things which are fitri and what are the standards. Okay, these three things that we have mentioned here are some of the standards of something which is fitri. Okay? These standards are important for us. And the reason why they're important for us is because when we have a standard, then when we claim that something is natural, something is innate, something is fitri, then we can always measure it to that standard. I'll give you an example. We first define what is design, and we come up with a standard for design, right? We say that design means multiple objects that work together for a greater purpose. These three things give us a standard for what is design. And then when we say there is design in the universe, and you point towards the human eye, you point towards, for example, the forest, then you measure it to these three standards. Multiple components, yes. Working together, yes. For a higher purpose, yes. Therefore, there is design in the eye. There is design in the forest. Or even for miracles. I'm just running through some examples with you. Even for miracles, we have a standard. It has to be something supernatural, performed by somebody who is claiming to be a prophet, for example, cannot be taught or learned, so on and so forth. Okay? Then when we come across a miracle, the parting of the seas, the bringing of the dead to life, for example, the splitting of the moon, we start comparing it. Does it fit our criteria? Does it not fit our criteria? Standards are important. Now we want to see what things are fitri. But whenever we claim that something is fitri, then we have to be able to measure it up to these standards. Number one, is it present in all societies? Number two, present in all eras? Number three, present in children and something that they know without being taught. If it meets these three criteria, we say that that inclination is a fitri inclination. I hope that clarifies it. Now, moving on to today's material, I'd like to first pose a question to you. So given that these are the standards for all those things which are said to be fitri, said to be natural for us, said to be innate to us, can you now name for me what are some things which are fitri, which are natural to human beings? What is part of human fitrah? What are some innate inclinations that a human being has? Okay, the need to be loved. All right. So the need to be loved is something that's there within human beings. One could argue that a part of it is also there in animals. So maybe that is a gharida, the desire to be loved. But you could also argue that the need to be profoundly loved is not there within other animals. It's only there within human beings. Okay. And you would go on to argue that a child, for example, feels a need to be loved. In all societies, you find a need to be loved. In all eras, you find a need to be loved. So that's good. Inclination towards perfection. Thank you for sharing that as well. Yes, there is an inclination towards perfection, and we're going to work on defining that one today. What is this inclination towards perfection within a human being? So I'm going to avoid commenting on that. Anything else that is part of the human fitrah? It's part of the way human beings think. They function that way naturally. And something that's tied to their higher purpose. The need to be accepted to some extent, yes, that could be argued that it is part of human fitrah because you find children have this need for acceptance, to be accepted by their peers, to be acknowledged by their peers, to be appreciated by their peers. And you find that every society, you have people like that. So human beings just function that way. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perhaps has put this inclination within us for us to want to be accepted, so that we seek out the acceptance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not the acceptance of people who are around us. But that's an important point there. Anything else? So let's come to the second one, inclination towards perfection. And we'll explain some things which are fitri within a human being. So coming to the next slide. There we go. So as we've pointed out, human beings have a natural inclination to perfection, towards kamal, towards all those things which we think are perfections. One of the examples is that human beings have a natural inclination towards a higher state of knowledge. They always want to remain away from ignorance, and they want to go towards knowledge because they see having knowledge as a perfection. There's a beautiful hadith where one of our imams, I believe it's the first imam, he says that the value of knowledge is something known to everyone. And then he demonstrates a proof for it. And he says that even the person who has no knowledge, if you were to tell him you do not have knowledge, he doesn't like that. And the one who has knowledge, for example, if you tell them that they have knowledge, or even if they don't, if a person who has knowledge, tell them they have knowledge, then they like that. So you tell anybody that you do not have knowledge, regardless of whether they do or they don't like it. You tell them that you have knowledge, they like it because human beings see knowledge or having knowledge as a perfection. We have a natural disposition towards acquiring knowledge. Okay. And from there comes something that is fitri to all of us. And I was hoping that one of us would mention it, and that is a sense of curiosity. That human beings are born with a sense of curiosity. Human beings are born with a sense of exploring the unknown, wanting to know the unknown, which other animals and other beings may not have. Okay, so we see that we have a sense of curiosity, and that stems from our natural inclination towards knowledge, which we see as a perfection. Another inclination that we have within us is towards beauty. Beauty, we see it as a perfection. Beauty, everybody wants to be thought of as beautiful. We try to beautify ourselves. We don't have to be taught that there's something called beauty. It's natural within us. You look at all the societies out there, they all have art, they all have expressions of beauty. And even if you go back, civilizations back to the Egyptian civilization or before them, they also had a sense of beauty. So wanting beauty is a natural inclination within human beings. And therefore you find that one of the things we have within us is the desire to purify ourselves, to do tazkiyah of ourselves. So point number one, let's keep in mind, is that it is natural within all human beings to seek out perfection. What's more important is that it is natural within all human beings to seek out absolute perfection. In Arabic, this is known as kamal mutlaq, or in Farsi rather, absolute perfection, unconditional perfection. You will find that as human beings, we are never satisfied with a limited perfection. Just think about how our lives are. We always have a goal, right? And we say to ourselves that if I achieve that goal, I will be satisfied. And what happens when we achieve that goal? I want to have $1 million house by the time I'm 35. What happens when we achieve that goal? What does every human being do? He looks for the next goal, a higher goal. All right, what is next? Because he realizes that that is a limited perfection and it does not fulfill him, because his inclination is not just for perfection. His inclination is what? His inclination is towards absolute perfection, unconditional perfection. We have even in the hadith that two people will never be satisfied. One is the seeker of knowledge. No matter how much knowledge a person seeks, you find that he is never satisfied, always wanting to know more. And the second is the seeker of dunya, or the seeker of wealth. He too will never be satisfied. And Imam Khomeini, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, gave an example. He said, try to imagine somebody who is a king. And as a king, as kings are, they want to rule over the entire world. They always want to expand their boundaries. They always want to conquer new areas. So imagine that a king were to conquer the entire world, and he became the ruler of every land on the face of the earth. And then you informed that king that there's just one small island. Let's take Richmond as a small island. I'm in Richmond at the moment. That is not under your control. What will that king want to do? Will he be satisfied with what he has in his control? He is not satisfied with it. He wants that one thing that he does not have, right? This is part of our desire for what we see is absolute perfection. Then the scholars point out, point number 3. So look, point number 1, we have an inclination to perfection. Okay? We see that within ourselves. Point number 2 is we have an inclination towards unlimited perfection. We are not satisfied until we find absolute perfection. Point number 3, absolute perfection can never be found in the world of creation, in the creatures, in physical beings, or even in immaterial beings that are not physical, but they are created, right? Why? Because whenever we see them, whenever we see that status, whenever we acquire that status, we recognize a few things about it. Number one, they're always limited in time and space. Okay? There are places where they are not. There are times where they are not. And therefore, there are things which they are not aware of. They don't have knowledge of certain things. Right? For example, I do not have knowledge of what is going to happen 100 years from now, or some or a lot of what happened 100 years before. Our power is limited as well. Every being that's created, his power is limited in space and in time, for example. Okay? There are certain things that they don't control. So that's not absolute perfection. They're always between potential and actuality. I mean that every created being is created with a potential and is moving towards perfection, towards actualizing its potential. Right? And therefore, it is always going from one level of perfection to another level of perfection. A seed is moving towards becoming a tree. Particles in the universe, for example, are moving towards becoming a solar system or becoming a galaxy, right? Everything is moving towards its perfection. That means that it is not absolutely perfect, right? Number 3, it is relative in its perfection. It is more perfect than what is below it, but less perfect than what is above it. No matter how much knowledge someone has, Allah says in the Quran, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Above every knowledgeable person, there is one more knowledgeable or the most knowledgeable. Okay, always relative in our perfection. So when we look at the perfections around us, we see that they are not absolutely perfect, they are relatively perfect. Okay, and they are contingent upon others. I mean, they are dependent upon others. Their perfection is not their own. So we look at the moon at the night, the full moon in the middle of the lunar month. It is glorious, it is amazing. And yet we recognize that the light that it has, it's not its own light. It is depending upon the sun for that light. That's not absolute perfection. So whenever we look in the world of creation, we find that nothing in the world of creation fulfills our natural inclination towards absolute perfection. And therefore, you find that human beings can never be satisfied, never come to rest, never be fulfilled, right? Until they incline towards the Creator and they have an experience of the Creator and they have an experience with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Allah says in the Quran, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ. That's the meaning of this. That is it not only with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything else that we seek, there will not be itminanul qalb in it. When you seek it, then you will seek something else. You will not stop. It will not fully satisfy you. It is only in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can this human inclination towards absolute perfection be fulfilled. Okay. Now, my next question for you is that we have made claims that human beings have a natural inclination towards God. And we have tried to explain how this natural inclination comes about to be. It doesn't mean that a human being is born with the knowledge that God exists. Okay? But it means that his mind is wired in such a way that he will go seeking and he will keep on seeking and he will not find rest until he finds God, until he finds Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My question for you is, what proof do we have of this? If a non-Muslim were to come and ask you what? Ask you, demonstrate for me that human beings have such an inclination, how would you demonstrate it for them? What proofs do you have available to you? Not to prove the existence of God, no, to prove that such a natural inclination towards perfection, towards knowledge, that having a sense of curiosity, for example, exists within human psyche, exists within the human being. What proof would you present? Okay, the magicians of Fir'aun immediately accepted the truth when they saw it. So we can demonstrate that in human history, we find that even people who have been subject to dogmatism, to certain dogma, and they have lived that dogma, and they have been under great strain. They have been under political oppression, for example. They have lived under tyranny, but when they have seen the truth, they have naturally inclined towards it and they have accepted it. They have been able to come out of the mold that was created by ideological and political factors in their society. And the only way for them to come out, and one example would be the magicians of Fir'aun, but one can think of many other examples. The only way for them to be able to come out is if they had a natural inclination towards the truth. Okay? So that's one way of demonstrating it. How else would you demonstrate it? Lack of contentment. So we could always ask somebody to go into themselves, without pointing out examples from society or examples from human history. We would say, look into yourself. Is there at any point where you find contentment, in everything else that you seek? I mean, even somebody like, let's take Bill Gates, for example, for the lack of any other example. He built Microsoft to where it is. He achieved a lot of things, but you find that even towards the end of his life, he is not content. He's still moving towards achieving more and more goals. So, there's a lack of contentment within a human being for as long as they have not acquired absolute perfection. That could be one argument. It's important for us to have arguments available to us in case we have to talk to ourselves or our children or our family or our friends or our colleagues. It's important to have evidence in hand. So let's look at some evidence together then, inshallah. All right. Proof of fitrah from sociology and anthropology. Okay. This is a very interesting argument, and we can look further into sociology and anthropology to find examples that human beings are born with certain inclinations. This particular article was published in the Guardian newspaper, and the title of the article was "Children Are Born Believers in God According to an Academic." And the gist of the argument that he presented, and this academic is Dr. Justin Barrett. The name doesn't appear on the article there, but Dr. Justin Barrett, for those who are interested in later following up. He claimed, this was back in 2008, that children are born believers in God, meaning that they do not simply acquire religious beliefs through indoctrination. Okay, and so let's look at his claim first, and then we're going to look at the proof for his claim And this article was important to me, not just because the person claiming it, Dr. Justin Barrett, is a psychologist and a researcher at Oxford Center for Anthropology and the Mind, but because he actually carried out a survey. And he did work with children in particular to try and demonstrate his claim. So he's trying to provide some type of scientific evidence that there are certain modalities of thinking, certain ways of thinking that are natural and inbuilt in all human beings. Okay. So, what is his main claim? He says that the preponderance of scientific evidence for the past 10 years or so has shown that a lot more seems to be built into the natural development of children's minds than what we once thought, including a predisposition to see the natural world as designed and purposeful. That you don't have children to teach children that this world is designed, that it requires a sentient designer, or that there is purpose in this world. They naturally assume that there is purpose to the world and that some kind of intelligent being is behind that purpose. He told BBC's Radio 4 program, if we threw a handful on an island and they raised themselves, I think they would believe in God. And the question is, well, how do you know that they would believe in God? And he says, well, I have done research and I have done a survey. And he points towards two particular surveys that he has done. In one study, either he has done or his colleagues have done, 6 and 7-year-olds who were asked why the first bird existed. Why do birds exist? Why did birds come into existence? If you ask an evolutionist, he will say that, well, there was, a simpler being and it evolved through mutation and natural selection. And, a flying creature came into existence. And, well, that flying creature, it makes beautiful songs because having beautiful songs is important for its survival and for its procreation. And that's it. Wassalam, right? He says, but when you ask children, they replied to make nice music, to make nice voices. And because it makes the world look nice. So now, making nice voices and making the world look nice, making the world look beautiful, is not something that needs to be taught to children. It is naturally ingrained within them. Okay. Another experiment on 12-month-old babies. This is interesting, going all the way to 12-month-old babies, 1-year-old babies, suggested that they were surprised by a film in which a rolling ball apparently created a neat stack of blocks from a disordered heap. So they basically took a ball, threw it towards a bunch of blocks which were just lying chaotically on the ground. And as the ball hit the blocks came directly and formed a nice structure. And when 12-month-old babies looked at that, they showed some surprise. They showed some unexpectedness in their facial features. And he said, well, you see that it's difficult for them to accept that something can come into being without a cause. Okay. So my question to you is, what does the study demonstrate about human nature? What does it demonstrate about our way of thinking? As in, what does it demonstrate is natural to us? Innate pursuit for meaning and purpose. Human beings will certainly look for purpose in the world around them. They don't have to be taught to look for purpose. They may define purpose differently, but the search for meaning and purpose is something that is innate and natural and fitri to every human being. That's excellent. What else does it show is fitri? Some things I've mentioned, and if we want to repeat those, that's fine as well. I just want to run through a chain of thought over here. So another thing that is natural and innate to a human being, as I mentioned, is a sense of beauty. Another thing that's innate and natural to a human being to seek is causality, that everything has a cause, meaning everything that is designed and structured must have a cause to it, or everything that is not permanent has a cause to it. Okay, and that it cannot be without a cause. All right, that is natural to a human being. It does not have to be taught to him. He doesn't have to look at the world around him to learn it either. Okay, it's a very important point. It's something I want you to take it and to park it somewhere in our minds and lock it up, but let it be there that, we know that everything has a cause. How do we know that everything has a cause? It is fitri within us. It is self-evident to us. We have been hardwired to think in that manner. When does that become important? When somebody comes and asks you that, how do we know that every designed structure has a sentient designer, has a designer? Isn't it through experience that we come to know that? And the answer is no, it's not through experience that we come to know that. It is something that is naturally known to us. It will become important one day, inshallah. Another example I want to share with you is from psychology. And there are two examples over here. We might be able to get through both of them. We may not be able to get through both of them, but we'll try to go through some of it anyways. What's interesting is that in the 20th century, a number of psychologists / philosophers have come and demonstrated that religion is natural to human beings. And religion is a manifestation of a natural inclination, a natural prototype, a natural manner of thinking within all human beings. It really confounded a lot of thinkers and philosophers, especially from the age of enlightenment coming into modernity. When Europe had the Renaissance, you had thinkers that came out that severely criticized religion, strongly attacked religion. You had thinkers like Hume and Voltaire and others. You had even scientific thought that now seemingly ran contrary to religion, like Darwin's theory of evolution. And yet, as we turn the corner into the 20th century, after all the attacks that religion has been given, people still continue to remain religious. Their numbers may vary, their commitment may vary, but religion is still a prominent force, not only in the 20th and the 21st century. And no matter how, they tried to explain religion, religion is a way of controlling the masses. Religion is born out of fear. Religion is born out of ignorance. Religion is a result of this and that. And yet, when you have knowledge and you have so-called free countries and democracies, you still have religion. And therefore, you find that a number of psychologists in the 20th century came out and said, well, that's because religion responds to an innate need, a natural need within a human being. It's not a response to an external stimulus, it's a response to an internal stimulus. There's two particular psychologists that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is William James, end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, American psychologist, I think of Scottish descent. He has a very interesting history to him. At a young age, when he had gone to some of the institutions where they took care of people who were mentally not well, he came across somebody who was in some type of a depression. And by looking at him and looking at people around him, he himself fell into profound, profound depression. And he came to almost the brink of suicide. He would have killed himself He describes the darkness like nothing you've ever come across. And he says that there's only one thing that helped me to come out of that darkness, that pulled me out of it. And that one thing was my belief in God and my belief in religion. So from that point onwards, he becomes a proponent of religion. So you have psychologists who, view religion negatively, like Sigmund Freud. But then you also have psychologists in the 20th and 20th century that posit a positive role for religion. So William James is one of those. And he says that first, let's make a distinction between religious experience and organized religion. Okay, so organized religion is, he says, a result of religious experiences. Organized religion is, going to church, for example, praying 5 times a day, having certain rituals, having certain sacraments, having a scripture, reading that scripture. People who follow the organized religion, they have a particular way of dressing. They have certain holidays. They have certain commemorations, certain celebrations. That's all part of organized religion. He says, let's separate that from something that's common to all human beings, and that is religious experience, some experience of something that is beyond us, an experience of something greater, something meaningful, however we define what that thing greater and meaningful is. For most people, an experience of God, okay? Then he says that, look, religious experiences also vary from person to person, okay? From culture to culture, religion to religion, but they share a commonality. And that commonality is that religion provides human beings something that they need, which is an assurance of safety and a temper of peace. And in relation to others, a preponderance of loving affections. He recognizes that human beings seek religion, seek what religion has to provide, because we have a natural desire to find fulfillment, to find peace, to find some type of safety. And so one of his famous statements, I believe, or one of the ways that his thought is described is that he says, religion may or may not be rational, but it is reasonable. There's a very interesting distinction being made over there. And he's saying that, well, I can't tell you whether the existence of God is rational or not. Okay? Are there proofs for the existence of God, or are they not proofs for the existence of God? What I can tell you is that a human being is wired in such a way that if he were to believe in religion, that to me is reasonable for him. That's very interesting. Okay. So anyways, the main point that he's arguing is that we have a natural inclination towards religious experiences and towards God. The second philosopher there, or not philosopher, but actually psychologist, is Carl Jung. Jung is a 20th century psychologist, a partly student of Sigmund Freud for a period of time, but then separated from Sigmund Freud. And one of the things that defines his thought is he says that there are 3 levels of human psyche, of human thought. There is our conscious. There are so many things that we are aware of, that we know, okay? That we know is within us. For example, I'm conscious of the fact that I am a man. I'm conscious of the fact that I am a human being, of what age I am, of what culture I am. These things we're consciously aware of. Then he says every human being has a personal subconscious. There are so many things within us that we are not aware of, but they are there within us. But those are specific to us, based on our own experiences, our own histories, our own personalities. And then he argues that there is a collective subconscious, that collectively we all as human beings have certain things which are a product of our collective history, that have developed through our history, that we all have, that we all acquire from our parents, everybody, acquires it from the previous generation, that is subconscious to us. We are not always actively aware of it, but we definitely live in the world based on those things within our subconscious. We function, we act, we decide, we think, we look at the world. All of us, not, and that's the important point, not just one or two of us, all of us look at the world because we have a collective subconscious. And that's very interesting. And then he says that archetypes are part of our collective subconscious, that we are born with certain symbols, images, concepts in mind. Now, I'm not be able to explain archetypes right now, but I'll give you an example that a child is born with the idea of a mother, and he actually seeks for a mother in the external world, seeks for somebody to provide a motherly figure to him. It's not that a child just learns that, this is what a mother is through experience I come to know. No. A child is born knowing that there is a motherly type figure, and they go seeking for that, and they find it, most of us, within our mothers. But there is that imprint, there is that archetype, there is that structure in the mind, he says. And he says that our belief in God is also a result of one of the archetypes. So a famous statement from him is that I do not have to believe in God, I know, meaning it is part of who I am. That's how I think, which is also very, very interesting. Now, last question for you before we end, inshallah, and that is, what have we demonstrated so far? What we have demonstrated so far is that a human being is not born indifferent. He has certain inclinations. He has certain preferences because he has a particular way of thinking, a particular way of functioning, a particular structure of how he goes through life. We call that the fitrah. But that's all we have proven, that a human being has this particular structure, this type of thinking within him. Question: how does that prove the existence of God? Existence of God is one thing. In the real world, just because we seek something does not mean that that thing necessarily exists, does it? All we have demonstrated so far is that our inclination to find God is natural. How does that become a proof for the existence of God? Hmm. Who created those inclinations? Um, so, that's a fair question to ask. Who created those inclinations? But then somebody could argue that that is becoming a circular argument. That, okay, you're trying to prove the existence of God by assuming that God created our inclinations, so that we would seek for Him, we would look for Him, and therefore, if God put those inclinations within us, it means that God exists. Well, my question is, I don't even accept that God exists, for example, as an atheist would say. Then how can I prove that, well, God exists and He created these inclinations, and now these inclinations prove to us that God exists? I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. But that's a really important question. They might argue that these inclinations exist because of evolution, that these inclinations have helped us to survive. And all they prove is that they are good factors for survival. that a sense of curiosity is good. If somebody wants to survive, they have to go searching. A sense of beauty is also good because as people adorn themselves, then, they come together as communities. They come together and they support each other and they help each other. They want to be with each other. They seek each other. Well, that's good for, survival of the human race. Okay. All right. We are going to run out of time, so I will come to the last slide. And there are two responses that our scholars have given. The first one is that it is not an independent proof for the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of our scholars do not call it the proof by natural inclination, the proof of fitrah. They call it the path of fitrah, the means of fitrah, for example. It means that it is a path that can help us to know God, to prove the existence of God, but in and of itself is not sufficient. And they point out that, look, the fitrah by itself cannot determine the object of the inclination. So we can determine, for example, that we have this desire for an absolute perfection. Okay? But what is absolute perfection? Is it, for example, owning everything in the world? Is it having as much knowledge as possible? Is it, for example, developing a certain quality? What is absolute perfection? Well, fitrah itself cannot determine that. It does not independently determine the existence of the object. It can tell you to go looking for it and to try and determine whether, the object of perfection that you're looking for exists or doesn't exist. It can push you towards it, but it cannot necessarily by itself demonstrate that there is an object of absolute perfection that's going to fulfill your need. For that, you need aql. You need the intellect. So the fitrah acts like a driver. The fitrah acts like a force, but then it also needs an intellect, rationality. And because I'm running out of time, very quickly, I'm going to point out to you, the search for perfection is natural. And one of the examples that you have in the Quran of a prophet trying to demonstrate that is the example of Prophet Ibrahim, when he looked at the stars and then the moon and the sun, and he kept telling his people, that is my Lord, that is my Lord, that is my Lord. And then when the stars would diminish, or the moon would go away, or the sun would set, he said, no, that cannot be my Lord, because that is temporary, that goes away. It is limited in its perfection. And then he said, Inni wajjahtu wajhiya lilladhi fatara as-samawati wal ard. So on one hand, he shows that the desire for perfection, for finding perfection, is natural to all of us. But secondly, he also uses rational argument to say that, look, the sun is not a source, not absolutely perfect. The moon is not absolutely perfect. The stars are not absolutely perfect. Then only their creator is the one of absolute perfection. Okay. The first argument says fitrah is not a proof for the existence of God. It's just a means, and a very important means for us to know God, but we need to supplement it with rational arguments. Number two says no, it can be a proof for the existence of God. And it says, look, every human inclination has an object of fulfillment. We haven't yet come across a natural human inclination that was not fulfilled in the world, right? Even those inclinations that we are not aware of, there has been an object of its fulfillment, right? So if we look at the gharida, a human being seeks a spouse, even if he was alone on an island, never saw another human being, he would still be searching, and he would be right in searching because there is something that fulfills that inclination. The example that Shaykh Murtaza gives is a beautiful example. He says, look at when a baby is born. And the moment it's born, it starts moving its lips. And here's the important part. It's not even aware of what it's doing, that it has this inclination. And that's how fitrah is for many of us. We're not even aware of those inclinations, that we are functioning according to them, but they are present within us. And he says, well, the baby is moving its lips, under this assumption that there is milk. Well, we say, well, just because a baby moves its lips, what guarantees that there is milk to fulfill the lips? It says, well, but there is. If there wasn't milk, then that inclination to move the lips would not have been there. The point that they try to make here is to say that if the object of fulfillment did not exist for any natural inclination, then that natural inclination would not have survived, would not have been present within human beings. And this way, we don't even have to assume that God created it. We say, no, look, there's inclination is there. That means there is a fulfillment to this inclination. And that's why it is present. That's what we have seen in each and every case, each and every inclination. And therefore, this inclination towards absolute perfection is also no exception. If there is an inclination towards absolute perfection, then there must be an object. By object, I mean a reference, a being that is absolutely perfect, and that would demonstrate the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, we will stop and pause over here, inshallah. There's, of course, a lot more to be said about fitrah, and books have been written about human fitrah. One of the sources, two sources that I have found to be very useful. One are the works of Shaykh Murtaza Bachoo, and secondly are the works of Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli, where he talks about fitrah, are very useful in understanding the concept of fitrah as it is explained in the Quran. All right, I'll open to any questions that you might have. Unfortunately, those resources have not been translated, Brother Muhammad, into English. I was really hoping that the book or the lectures by Shaykh Mutahari, known as Tawheed, they are available in Farsi. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. It's a shame that that book has not been translated into English. It was a series of lectures that he gave on the proofs for the existence of God in the beginning. And he talks about the path of fitrah first, and then he talks about the argument by design, and then he talks about the ontological argument and the cosmological argument as well. And he talks about the proofs for those arguments, or the evidence for those arguments, and responds to some of the criticisms or arguments against those proofs as well. It's really, really a good lecture series that he had given. Unfortunately, that has not been translated into English. And then Atla Jawadi has a tafsir mawdu'i, sequential, not sequential, but thematical tafsir, which is Fitrat dar Quran, Fitrah in the Quran, or Tawheed dar Quran, Tawheed in the Quran. And unfortunately, that has not been translated into English. The book Tawheed in the Quran, by the way, is also an excellent, excellent book. Unfortunately, only in Farsi at the moment. In the month of Ramadan, in the first half, I'll be giving a series of lectures known as Knowing Allah Through His Names, or Knowing Allah Through His Attributes, His Asma and His Sifat. These names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I don't think they are clearly understood within the Muslim community, and the depth of discussion that we find in our books and in our theology has not been discussed and has not been presented. So inshallah, from that book being one of the sources, I will be presenting in the first half of the month of Ramadan for those who are interested. But to answer your question, Brother Muhammad, no, it unfortunately have not been translated into English. Okay, if there are no further questions, then we will bring this session to an end. We have one more, or I have one more course that I'll be teaching in this term in the coming weeks, which is the Eye of Nur, Allahu Nuru Samawati wal Ard. What is the meaning of this verse? What does it mean that Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth? We will be shedding some clarity, God willing, on that. According to how Muslim theologians, mufassirin, and philosophers have explained. Inshallah, I hope that you will be able to join that session. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.